Hey guys, tonight we pull back the curtain on a different kind of history, true crime. Tonight we're going to be exploring stories about places that were meant to be safe. Sanctuaries, summer camps, quiet neighborhoods. The kinds of places where the doors are left unlocked and the windows are open to the night air. These are tales about the violation of that trust, about the moment when a haven becomes a hunting ground and the illusion of safety is shattered forever. They are stories that force us to confront a difficult truth, that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who trespass on sacred ground, leaving behind a silence that screams louder than any cry for help. It's a theme that touches a deep, primal fear, the fear that the one place you believe you are protected is where you are most vulnerable. Before you get comfortable, maybe listen for a moment to the quietest sound in your own space. The hum of the refrigerator, the sigh of the wind outside, the gentle creak of a floorboard. Think about how that silence holds a sense of peace, a sense of security. Now imagine that peace being broken, not by a loud noise, but by a chilling, unanswered question. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready to walk through these stories with a sense of respect and contemplation for the lives that were changed in an instant. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. It's always a comfort to know we're all here together, a global community sharing these quiet, late-night hours, trying to make sense of the darkness. Now, dim the lights, let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Oklahoma Girl Scout murders the summer of 1977 was meant to be a celebration. Across America, the nation was caught in a wave of nostalgia and forward-looking optimism. Star Wars had just premiered, igniting the imaginations of millions. The Queen's Silver Jubilee was a global event. For the Girl Scouts of America, it was a time of tradition, of forging friendships and learning self-reliance under the vast, open skies of the American heartland. In northeastern Oklahoma, nestled in the green, rolling foothills of the Ozark Mountains, Camp Scott was a local institution, a place where generations of girls had spent their summers learning to tie knots, build fires, and sing songs around a crackling campfire. It was a sprawling, rustic paradise of 410 acres, thick with oak and hickory trees, carved by winding creeks, and dotted with ancient, shadowy rock formations and caves. For decades, it had been a symbol of innocence, a protected world where the fears of the outside were kept at bay by the simple promise of summer vacation. The camp was preparing to open for its 29th season. On Sunday, June 12th, buses filled with excited girls, aged 8 to 18, rumbled down the dusty gravel roads leading to the entrance. For many, like 10-year-old Doris Denise Milner, it was a dream come true. Denise, as everyone called her, was a fourth grader from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. She was bright, a little shy, and immensely proud of being a Girl Scout. She had worked hard to earn the money for the 2-week session herself, selling cookies and calendars with a determination that belied her age. This was to be her very first time at a sleepaway camp, an adventure she had been anticipating for months. On the bus ride there, she sat beside her best friend, who would later recall Denise's quiet excitement, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery, the world transforming from familiar suburbs to the wild, untamed beauty of Mays County. Also on that bus was another first-time camper, 9-year-old Michelle Guza. Michelle was known for her infectious, gap-toothed grin and her boundless energy. She was a tomboy who loved sports, her glasses often perched on the end of her nose as she chased a ball or climbed a tree. Her mother was a troop leader and was also at the camp, serving as a unit leader for a different group of girls. This was meant to be a special bonding experience for them, a shared adventure in a place they both loved. Michelle was a seasoned Girl Scout, but like Denise, this was her first trip to Camp Scott. The third girl was the youngest of the trio, 8-year-old Lori Lee Farmer. Lori was the daughter of a prominent local doctor. She was known for her sweet nature and a love for the outdoors that was nurtured by her family. She was a bright, curious child, small for her age but full of life. She had attended a day camp at Camp Scott the previous summer and had fallen in love with it, begging her parents to let her go to the overnight camp this year. She couldn't wait to sleep in a tent, to live among the trees, and to experience the magic of the woods at night. The 3 girls, Denise, Michelle, and Lori, were strangers when they boarded the bus, but they were bound by a shared sense of excitement for the adventure that lay ahead. They were assigned to the same unit, the Kiowa unit, which was the most remote and isolated section of the camp, designated for the youngest campers. Their home for the next 2 weeks would be tent number 8. As the girls arrived and began to settle in, a sense of unease was already subtly present, though it was largely unknown to the campers and most of the staff. Less than 2 months earlier, during a counselor training session in mid-April, something disturbing had happened. One of the counselors had returned to her tent to find it ransacked. Her belongings were thrown about, and her empty donut box had been crudely opened and left on her cot. Tucked inside the empty box was a handwritten note, folded neatly. The note was deeply unsettling. Written in a messy, almost violent scrawl, it read, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in Tent 1. The note was signed with a strange, jagged symbol. The incident was reported to the camp director, who dismissed it as a tasteless prank, likely perpetrated by local troublemakers. The note was thrown away. The warning, chillingly specific and profoundly sinister, was forgotten, dismissed as a bad joke in a place where real danger felt like a work of fiction. On that first evening, as the sun began to set, the camp's idyllic atmosphere began to shift. A powerful thunderstorm, a common occurrence in an Oklahoma June, was rolling in. The sky darkened prematurely, and a cool, damp wind rustled through the leaves of the dense forest. The girls in the Kiowa unit, including those in Tent 8, huddled together, the excitement of their first night mingling with the nervous energy of the approaching storm. They wrote letters home by flashlight, their small, cursive letters filling pages with details of their first day. Lori Farmer wrote to her mother, her words a poignant snapshot of a child's simple happiness. "I have a new friend," she wrote, likely referring to one of her 2 new tent mates. They were getting to know one another, 3 young girls on the cusp of a great adventure, their futures stretching out before them like an endless summer. As the storm broke, the sound of thunder echoed through the hills, and heavy rain began to lash against the canvas of their tent. It was the kind of storm that drives people deeper into their shelters, muffling all other sounds of the night. It provided a perfect cover. The girls were last seen alive around 7 p.m. when a camp counselor checked on them. They were safe in their tent, preparing for bed, their sleeping bags laid out side by side. The plan for the next morning was simple: a long hike to see the caves in the nearby hills. Sometime during that long, dark, and storm-racked night, an intruder or intruders slipped through the rain and the darkness. They made their way to the Kiowa unit, the most secluded part of the camp, situated nearly 100 yards from the counselor's quarters and the camp latrine. They walked past 7 other tents filled with sleeping children and stopped at tent number 8. The morning of June 13th dawned gray and wet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. A camp counselor, Carla Wilhite, was walking up the path toward the Kiowa unit shortly before 6 a.m., heading for the showers. As she passed tent 8, she noticed something was wrong. A girl's sleeping bag was lying on the path, soaked from the rain. It looked out of place, but she didn't think too much of it at first. But a little further on, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Lying just off the trail, about 150 yards from the tent, was the body of a young girl. The initial shock gave way to a wave of horror and disbelief. The camp's peaceful, ordered world shattered in an instant. The counselor ran screaming for help, her cries cutting through the morning stillness. The camp director was alerted, and the terrible, systematic process of accounting for the children began. A quick check of tent 8 revealed the unthinkable. The tent was empty. The sleeping bags belonging to Lori Farmer, Michelle Guza, and Doris Denise Milner were gone. A frantic, desperate search of the immediate area began. Soon, the other 2 girls were found, their bodies concealed near the trail leading to the camp's fishing pond. They had been brutally murdered. The scene was one of unimaginable tragedy. The innocence of Camp Scott had been violated in the most profound way possible. The remaining 140 campers were immediately woken and gathered, their sleepy confusion quickly turning to fear as they saw the faces of the adults around them. Parents were called, their mornings shattered by phone calls that no parent should ever receive. A fleet of buses, the same ones that had delivered the children full of hope and excitement just the day before, were called back to evacuate them. The girls, many of them crying and clinging to their friends, were taken to a warehouse in the nearby town of Shoto, where they were met by their horrified and grief-stricken parents. Camp Scott, the beloved summer sanctuary, was closed. It would never open its doors to campers again. As the last bus pulled away, leaving behind an eerie silence, a massive law enforcement operation descended on the grounds. The search for a killer had begun, but the spirit of a place built on trust and innocence, was already dead. The green woods of Mays County, once a symbol of adventure, were now a crime scene, holding a secret as dark and deep as the caves hidden in its hills. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, a sense of paralysis fell over the state of Oklahoma, followed by a wave of collective grief and rage. The murder of 3 young children in a place designed to protect them was a crime that felt personal to everyone. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, or OSBI, took the lead, launching what would become the largest and most expensive manhunt in the state's history. The 410 acres of Camp Scott and the thousands of acres of surrounding wilderness were immediately sealed off, transformed into a massive grid for investigators to comb through. The FBI was called in to assist, bringing their resources and expertise to a case that had instantly captivated and horrified the nation. The search for evidence began in earnest, a desperate attempt to find some small clue, some tangible piece of the monster who had crept into the camp during the storm. The crime scene itself was a heartbreaking and complex puzzle. The girls' bodies had been found roughly 150 yards from their tent, suggesting they had been taken from their sleeping bags and led or carried into the woods. The cause of death was determined to be a combination of strangulation and blunt force trauma. The killer had left behind several crucial yet confounding items. Inside Tent 8, investigators found a roll of duct tape with a partial palm print on it, as well as a gag made from the same tape. Outside, on the trail leading away from the tent, they discovered a flashlight. The lens of the flashlight was covered with a piece of tape, with only a small pinhole poked through, a modification that would allow the user to see a few feet ahead without casting a large, revealing beam of light. This suggested a killer with a degree of forensic awareness, someone who knew how to move stealthily in the dark. The flashlight, the tape, and a length of rope found at the scene became the central pieces of physical evidence. Investigators believed these items held the key, that they would surely lead them to the person responsible. As the physical search continued, a psychological profile of the killer began to emerge. This was not a crime of passion or a random act of violence. The choice of the most remote tent, the specific targeting of 3 girls, and the eerie echo of the threatening note found 2 months prior all pointed to a predator who had planned his actions. The note, which had been tragically discarded, was now seen as a terrifying prophecy. The camp director who had dismissed it was consumed by guilt, and investigators scrambled to reconstruct its exact wording from the memories of the counselors who had seen it. The description of a mission to kill 3 girls was too precise to be a coincidence. It suggested the killer had been watching the camp, perhaps for weeks or even months, learning its layout, its routines, and its vulnerabilities. The investigation quickly zeroed in on a name that sent a chill through local law enforcement and the surrounding communities: Gene Leroy Hart. Hart was a 34-year-old local man with a long and violent criminal history. He was a convicted rapist, kidnapper, and burglar who had spent much of his adult life in and out of prison. More importantly, he was a fugitive. In 1973, he had been convicted of kidnapping and raping 2 pregnant women and had been sentenced to over 300 years in the Mays County Jail. But just 4 years later, on September 16, 1973, he had escaped. For the past 4 years, he had been living as a ghost, a phantom hiding in the rugged wilderness he knew better than anyone. Hart was a member of the Cherokee Nation and had grown up just a mile from Camp Scott. The woods, caves, and hills that made up the camp's landscape were his childhood backyard. He was a skilled outdoorsman and survivalist, known to live in the many caves that riddled the area. He was, in every conceivable way, the perfect suspect. The theory that formed was a simple and horrifying one. Hart, living off the land and hiding from the law, had been using the caves near Camp Scott as his hideout. From there, he could have easily observed the camp, learned its rhythms, and planned his attack. The threatening note found in April was seen as his calling card, a boast from a man who felt untouchable in his own territory. The manhunt for Jean Leroy Hart began immediately and with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Hundreds of law enforcement officers, joined by local volunteers, swept through the dense, unforgiving terrain. Helicopters with infrared sensors flew overhead, searching for any sign of a campfire or body heat. Bloodhounds were brought in, their bays echoing through the hollows. But Hart was like smoke. He knew every trail, every hiding place, every trick to evade capture in the woods that had raised him. The search was grueling, hampered by the summer heat, the thick underbrush, and the sheer vastness of the area. Meanwhile, the evidence gathered from the scene was being meticulously analyzed. The flashlight was sent to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. The duct tape, the rope, and hair and fiber samples were all subjected to the most advanced forensic techniques available in 1977. But this was an era before DNA profiling. Forensics was a much more comparative and subjective science. Hair analysis could only determine if a strand was consistent with a suspect's hair, not if it was a definitive match. Fingerprint analysis was reliable, but only if a clear print could be lifted. The partial palm print on the duct tape was promising, but it was just that, partial. As the weeks turned into months, the manhunt for Hart continued, casting a long shadow of fear over the region. His face was on wanted posters in every town. Stories of his past crimes were retold, his reputation growing to that of a near-mythical bogeyman lurking in the hills. The failure to capture him only added to his legend and to the community's anguish. Finally, after 10 long months of searching, the break came. On April 6, 1978, acting on a tip, law enforcement surrounded a small, isolated cabin in the woods about 50 miles from Camp Scott. The cabin belonged to a Cherokee medicine man, and inside, they found him, Jean Leroy Hart. He was emaciated and weary, but alive. The great manhunt was over. With Hart in custody, the prosecution began to build its case, and they believed it was a powerful one. A search of a cave system that Hart was known to use, located just a few miles from the camp, yielded a treasure trove of seemingly incriminating evidence. They found a collection of stolen items, including a pair of eyeglasses that were later identified as belonging to Michelle Guzza. They found photos, later proven to have been stolen from the ransacked counselor's tent during the April training session. This discovery directly linked Hart to the precursor event and the threatening note. Furthermore, forensic analysis from the FBI lab concluded that hairs found on the adhesive side of the duct tape at the crime scene were consistent with Hart's hair. Investigators also believed that the complex knots used to bind one of the victims were of a type that Hart, a skilled outdoorsman, would know how to tie. The public, the families of the victims, and most of law enforcement were convinced. They had their man. The monster from the woods was caught, and justice was finally within reach. The stage was set for one of the most highly anticipated and emotionally charged trials in Oklahoma history, a trial that everyone believed would have only one possible outcome. The trial of Jean Leroy Hart began in March of 1979 in the small town of Pryor, Oklahoma. The national media descended on the town, turning the local courthouse into the epicenter of a story that had held the country in its grip for nearly 2 years. The atmosphere was thick with tension and expectation. For the families of Lori, Michelle, and Denise, and for a public that had followed every twist of the manhunt, this was to be the final chapter, the moment of legal and moral reckoning. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Sid Wise, laid out their case with confidence, presenting what they believed was an unbreakable chain of circumstantial evidence that pointed directly and exclusively to Hart. They presented the items found in the cave, the stolen photographs from the counselor's tent and the eyeglasses belonging to Michelle Guzza, placing Hart in the vicinity and linking him to a precursor event at the camp. They presented the expert testimony from the FBI lab, stating that head and pubic hairs found on the adhesive side of the duct tape at the crime scene were microscopically consistent with Hart's. They brought in a knot expert to testify that the bindings used on the victims were similar to knots Hart was known to use. They painted a picture of Hart as a cunning, violent predator, a fugitive who had been living like an animal in the woods, observing the camp and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. To the jury and the public, the narrative seemed complete. The evidence, though circumstantial, felt overwhelming in its cumulative weight. However, Hart's defense team, led by a savvy local attorney named Garvin Isaacs, had a different strategy. Isaacs was a formidable courtroom presence, and he knew that in the absence of a confession or a direct witness, the state's entire case rested on the interpretation of that circumstantial evidence. His job was to introduce a single powerful element, reasonable doubt, and he began to do so piece by piece with methodical precision. He attacked the physical evidence, exposing the limitations of 1970s forensic science. The hair analysis, he argued, was not a positive identification. Consistent with was not the same as a match. He reminded the jury that thousands of other people, particularly those with Native American heritage common in the area, could have hair with similar characteristics. The defense then turned to the evidence that the prosecution didn't have. The most significant piece of physical evidence was the partial palm print found on the roll of duct tape inside Tent 8. The FBI had compared it to Hart's prints and found it was not a match. The prosecution had downplayed this, but Isaacs made it a cornerstone of his defense. An unidentified print at the heart of the crime scene was a gaping hole in their theory. He also pointed out that of the more than 40 fingerprints lifted from the flashlight found on the trail, none of them belonged to Jean Leroy Hart. He argued that the cave where the stolen items were found was not a secret lair known only to Hart. It was a well-known spot, accessible to many people in the area. He suggested that the real killer could have planted the items there to frame Hart, who was already a notorious fugitive and an easy scapegoat. Isaacs also presented an alternative theory. He suggested that law enforcement, under immense public and political pressure to solve this horrific crime, had succumbed to tunnel vision. They had focused on Hart, the obvious suspect, from day one, and in doing so, had failed to seriously investigate other leads or consider the possibility that the evidence simply didn't add up. He called into question the integrity of the investigation itself, implying that evidence may have been mishandled or misinterpreted in the rush to secure a conviction. The defense painted a picture not of a cunning killer, but of a flawed investigation that had pinned its hopes on a convenient, but ultimately innocent, man. After a month-long trial, the case went to the jury. Deliberations began. The hours stretched on, filled with an agonizing tension. Everyone in the courthouse, everyone in Oklahoma, waited. Then the jury returned. The courtroom was packed, silent. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict. Not guilty, on all 3 counts of murder. A wave of audible gasps and sobs swept through the room. The families of the victims collapsed in tears. The prosecutors and investigators stood in stunned disbelief. Jean Leroy Hart, the man the entire state was certain had committed these terrible crimes, was a free man, at least in regards to the murders. He was immediately returned to custody to serve out the remaining 305 years of his sentence for his previous kidnapping and rape convictions. The acquittal sent a shockwave through the community and the legal system. How could a jury, presented with so much evidence, find him not guilty? The answer lay in the high standard of the American justice system. Guilt must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense had successfully created just enough doubt. The unmatchable prints, the inconclusive hair samples, the questions about the investigation itself, to make a conviction impossible. For many, however, the verdict was not a reflection of innocence, but a failure of the system. They remained utterly convinced of his guilt. Just over a year later, on June 4, 1979, the story took its final, frustrating turn. Jean Leroy Hart, who had been participating in a recreational event in the prison yard, collapsed and died of a massive heart attack. He was 35 years old. With his death, any hope of a future confession, or of ever learning the definitive truth from the man at the center of it all, was extinguished forever. He died protesting his innocence in the Girl Scout murders. The legacy of the case is one of enduring sorrow and unanswered questions. Camp Scott was permanently closed, its land eventually sold to a private trust. The buildings were torn down, and nature has slowly reclaimed the trails where the girls once walked. It remains a silent, haunted place. In the decades that followed, the case was revisited. In 1989, the FBI re-examined the physical evidence with emerging DNA technology, but the results were inconclusive. Again, in 2008 and as recently as 2022, advances in DNA testing brought renewed hope. Saliva stains on the back of the duct tape were tested against Hart's DNA profile, which had been preserved. The results were once again agonizingly ambiguous, unable to either definitively link him to the crime or fully exonerate him. The case remains officially unsolved. The Oklahoma Girl Scout murders stand as a chilling monument to uncertainty. It is a story about the devastating loss of innocence, not just for 3 young girls, but for an entire community that was forced to learn that no place, no matter how protected, is truly safe from the darkness. The questions linger, whispered on the wind that still blows through the empty, silent woods of Mays County. Was Gene Leroy Hart the killer, a man who beat the system on a technicality? Or was he a convenient scapegoat, his guilt assumed while the real killer slipped away, never to be identified? The truth, it seems, was buried with 3 little girls and the man accused of killing them, leaving behind only a profound, unending ache of not knowing. The ghosts of Camp Scott linger in the silence of the Oklahoma woods, a story of innocence lost and justice just out of reach. But some mysteries don't hide in the wilderness. They unfold in plain sight, in the crowded streets of a bustling city, leaving behind a puzzle that defies a simple solution: the vanishing of Dorothy Arnold in the winter of 1910. New York City was the thrumming, incandescent heart of the Gilded Age. It was a city of stark, almost violent contrasts, a place where the unimaginable wealth of families like the Vanderbilts and the Astors was showcased in opulent mansions along Fifth Avenue, while just blocks away, millions lived in the desperate poverty of crowded tenements. It was a city of rigid social codes, where a person's name and family connections dictated their entire world. For a young woman of society, life was a carefully choreographed performance of teas, balls, and chaperoned meetings, with marriage as the ultimate and expected finale. Yet, beneath this glittering surface of order and propriety, New York was also a city of anonymity. Its streets were a chaotic river of humanity, a place where, for all the rigid structures of high society, a person could, with shocking ease, simply be swallowed by the crowd and disappear. Into this world was born Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold. In 1910, she was 25 years old, the daughter of Francis R. Arnold, a highly respected and wealthy importer of fine goods. The Arnold family was not on the level of the Astors, but they were firmly entrenched in the upper echelons of New York society. They resided in a stately 4-story brownstone at 108 East 79th Street, a home of quiet elegance staffed by a team of servants. Dorothy had been afforded every privilege her station could offer. She was educated at the prestigious Vassar College, where she majored in literature and distinguished herself as a bright and promising student. Unlike many of her peers, whose ambitions extended only to making a good match, Dorothy harbored a secret and powerful dream. She wanted to be a writer. This ambition was a source of quiet friction within the family. To her father, the idea of his daughter pursuing a professional career, especially one as uncertain and public as writing, was unseemly. A woman of Dorothy's standing did not work. She managed a household and upheld the family name. Despite their immense wealth, Francis Arnold was known to be a man of strict, almost domineering authority, particularly when it came to his children. He saw Dorothy's literary aspirations not as a sign of intellect, but as a flight of fancy that needed to be reined in. Twice, Dorothy had submitted short stories to McClure's magazine, a popular publication of the era, and twice she had received rejection slips. The second rejection, for a story titled The Poinsettia, had arrived just before her disappearance. Her family later recalled that she had been deeply despondent about it, taking the criticism of her work as a personal failure. In the private world of her bedroom, she had burned her rejected manuscripts, a small symbolic act of a spirit feeling increasingly confined. Outwardly, however, Dorothy maintained the cheerful facade expected of her. On the morning of Monday, December 12, 1910, she appeared to be in good spirits. She came down for breakfast and chatted with her mother, discussing her plans for the day. Her younger sister, Marjorie, was set to have her debutante party soon, and Dorothy needed a new dress for the occasion. Around 11 a.m., she left the family home, dressed impeccably in a blue serge suit, a long blue coat, a distinctive black velvet hat adorned with blue and white plumes, and carrying a large sealskin muff. She told her mother she was going shopping. It was a perfectly normal errand for a young woman of her class. She noted she might not be home for lunch, and with a wave, she stepped out into the crisp winter air and began her walk south toward the bustling shopping district of Fifth Avenue. Her journey that day can be traced with a strange and frustrating clarity, a series of documented moments that lead directly to a void. Her first stop was at the Park and Tilford candy store on the corner of 59th Street and Fifth Avenue, where she charged a half-pound box of chocolates to the family account. She then continued her walk south, a solitary, elegant figure among the holiday crowds. Around midday, she stopped at a bank and withdrew $25 in cash, some equivalent to over $700 today. This was a significant amount of money for a young woman to be carrying, especially one who typically charged all her purchases. Her final known stop was at Brentano's bookstore, located at 27th Street and Fifth Avenue. Here, she purchased a book of lighthearted epigrams titled An Engaged Girl by E.M. Shannon. Inside the store, she happened to run into a friend, Gladys King. The two chatted for several minutes. Gladys would later report that Dorothy seemed perfectly normal and cheerful. She mentioned nothing of any troubles or unusual plans. She told Gladys that she was on her way to meet her mother for lunch at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, a statement that was later found to be untrue, as her mother was at home and had no such plans. As they parted ways outside the bookstore around 2 p.m., Dorothy told Gladys that she intended to take a stroll home through Central Park. With a smile and a wave, Dorothy Arnold continued walking south on Fifth Avenue toward 23rd Street. Gladys King watched her friend, a familiar figure in a stylish hat, merge into the dense, anonymous sea of faces and disappear. It was the last time anyone could ever say with certainty that they had seen her alive. That evening, the Arnold family gathered for dinner, but Dorothy's chair was empty. At first, they were not overly concerned. Dorothy was an adult, and it was not unheard of for her to dine with friends. But as the hours stretched on, from 7 to 8, then to 9, a quiet worry began to curdle into genuine fear. Her mother began making phone calls to Dorothy's friends, the polite inquiries growing more frantic with each call. No one had seen her. No one knew where she could be. The lie she had told Gladys King about meeting her mother for lunch now seemed sinister, a deliberate act of misdirection. The family's carefully ordered world began to tremble. By midnight, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. Yet, in a decision that would haunt the case for decades, Francis Arnold did not call the police. The patriarch of the Arnold family was a man obsessed with appearances and terrified of scandal. The thought of his family's name being dragged through the sensationalist yellow press of the era, of reporters digging into their private lives and speculating about his daughter's character, was anathema to him. He was convinced that involving the police would create a scandal that could ruin the family's reputation and Marjorie's upcoming social debut. He believed, or perhaps forced himself to believe, that Dorothy's disappearance had a simple, if unpleasant, explanation, and that it could be resolved quietly, privately, and above all, without public shame. He forbade anyone in the household from contacting the authorities. Instead, he made a phone call to a family friend, a man with connections and a reputation for discretion, John S. The bouncer Keith, a lawyer known for handling the delicate, private problems of New York's elite. The search for Dorothy Arnold would begin not as a public police investigation, but as a shadowy, private inquiry, a secret whispered in the backrooms of power. While precious time continued to bleed away, the city had swallowed Dorothy whole, and her own family, in their desperate attempt to avoid a scandal, were unwittingly helping it keep her hidden. For 6 agonizing weeks, the search for Dorothy Arnold was a ghost story whispered in the halls of power. Francis Arnold's obsession with social standing had created a parallel investigation, one that ran completely separate from the city's official channels. The lawyer, John Keith, and the agents of the Pinkerton Detective Agency were hamstrung from the start. They could not plaster Dorothy's face on lampposts or go door to door with her photograph. Their inquiries had to be cloaked in discretion, their questions couched in hypotheticals. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, but they weren't allowed to tell anyone what a needle looked like. They moved through the city's underbelly, visiting grim hospital wards and the cold, silent rooms of the public morgue, looking for an unnamed young woman who might match Dorothy's description. They cross-referenced passenger lists for every steamship leaving the port of New York, a monumental task, searching for a Dorothy Arnold, or perhaps a Jane Smith, who might have booked passage to Europe to escape her life. While this phantom search unfolded, life inside the Arnold mansion on East 79th Street became an exercise in unbearable tension. A veneer of normalcy was maintained at all costs. The servants were sworn to a suffocating silence. Marjorie Arnold's debutante party, the very event Dorothy was shopping for a dress for, went ahead as planned. It was a grotesque charade of social grace, a party haunted by the specter of the missing sister. Every polite conversation, every toast, every dance must have felt like a betrayal. The family was trapped in a gilded cage of their own making, unable to properly grieve or publicly appeal for help, all to protect a reputation that was becoming more of a prison than a privilege. Frances Arnold waited by the telephone, clinging to the hope of a ransom note, a call from a kidnapper that would give this nightmare a tangible form he could fight with his money. But the phone remained silent. The private investigators, for all their limitations, were thorough. In the quiet confines of Dorothy's bedroom, they began to uncover the first cracks in the pristine facade the family had presented. They found her personal letters, and within them, the evidence of a secret life. The most significant discovery was her clandestine correspondence with a man named George C. Griscom. Junior Griscom was a 42-year-old engineer from a respectable family, a man Dorothy had met years earlier. To her father, an older man from another city was an entirely unsuitable match, and the secrecy of the communication confirmed his worst fears about his daughter's judgment. The letters revealed a young woman deeply unhappy with her life at home, a place she once referred to as a hellish place. She wrote of her literary ambitions and her frustrations, painting a portrait not of a contented socialite, but of a stifled artist desperate for a different life. The discovery of Griscom immediately made him the primary, albeit private, suspect. Had Dorothy, in a fit of romantic rebellion, run away to be with him? The Pinkertons tracked him down only to find the theory fall apart. Griscom was in Italy with his family and provided an ironclad alibi for the time of Dorothy's disappearance. He expressed genuine shock and concern, even forwarding the last postcard he had received from her, a note about her literary disappointments, sent just 4 days before she vanished. He willingly assisted the investigators, but he was a dead end. After 6 weeks, the futility of their secret search was undeniable. No ransom note had arrived. No credible sightings had been confirmed. The private investigators had exhausted every lead they could pursue without public assistance. The pressure on Frances Arnold, from both his increasingly frantic family and his own lawyer, became immense. The strategy of silence had failed. With a heavy heart, he finally accepted the inevitable. On January 26, 1911, he walked into a New York City police station and did the one thing he had fought for weeks to avoid. He officially reported his daughter missing. The moment the story was released to the press, Frances Arnold's worst fears were realized. The case of the vanishing heiress became an overnight sensation, a national obsession. The combination of wealth, beauty, high society, and a baffling mystery was perfect fodder for the city's competing newspapers. Headlines screamed from every newsstand. Reporters, like a pack of hungry wolves, descended upon the Arnold home, the police department, and anyone who had ever known Dorothy. The family's carefully guarded privacy was shattered into a million pieces, their name now fodder for public speculation and gossip. The police, led by the capable but frustrated Inspector Joseph A. Farrow, were now faced with a case where the trail was not merely cold, but frozen over. 6 weeks of time had allowed witnesses' memories to fade, potential evidence to be washed away by the city's winter grime, and the trail to be hopelessly obscured. They began by going over the same ground the Pinkertons had, but this time with the full public force of the law. They dredged the icy reservoir in Central Park, a grim and fruitless task. They re-interviewed Gladys King, the clerks at Brentano's and the candy store, and anyone who might have seen Dorothy on that fateful walk down Fifth Avenue. But her path still ended abruptly, as if she had stepped through an invisible door in the middle of the sidewalk. With the official investigation came new, darker theories that the family had refused to consider. The most pervasive and scandalous of these was the possibility of a botched illegal abortion. In an era before safe and legal procedures, this was a desperate and dangerous path many women were forced to take. A secret pregnancy would have been the ultimate ruin for a family like the Arnolds. The police took this theory seriously, raiding a number of known illegal clinics in New York and surrounding states. One particularly strong lead pointed to a clinic in Pennsylvania, where a woman matching Dorothy's general description was rumored to have died during a procedure, but the lead could never be confirmed. The clinic's records, if they ever existed, were gone, and its practitioners were masters of silence. The Arnold family vehemently denied the possibility, but the rumor clung to the case, a dark stain on Dorothy's memory. The public search had opened a Pandora's box of ugly speculation, and the family was left to wonder if the truth, whatever it was, could possibly be worse than the scandal they had created by trying to avoid one. As the official police investigation ground on through the spring and summer of 1911, the case of Dorothy Arnold transformed from a criminal inquiry into a piece of American folklore. The lack of any real evidence created a vacuum that was filled by rampant speculation, crank letters, and a bewildering number of false sightings. The police department was inundated. Reports flooded in from across the country and even from overseas. Dorothy was spotted working as a waitress in San Diego, shopping in a Boston department store, living on a ranch in Arizona. Each lead, no matter how flimsy, was dutifully followed up by local authorities at the request of the NYPD, and each one ended in disappointment. She was everywhere and nowhere at once, a phantom a nation was collectively trying to find. Francis Arnold, having lost control of the narrative, attempted to seize it back. He spent a fortune, estimated to be over $100,000, a colossal sum at the time, funding the investigation and offering rewards. He publicly articulated his own theory, which he clung to with a father's desperate hope. He believed Dorothy had been attacked and killed in Central Park and that her body had been disposed of in the reservoir. When the exhaustive police dredging of the reservoir yielded nothing, he paid for it to be dredged again, unable to accept that the park didn't hold the answer. Privately, however, his beliefs wavered. In a moment of unguarded grief, he confessed to a reporter, "I am now convinced that my daughter has been kidnapped, and that the kidnappers are holding her for a large ransom, but are afraid to communicate with me because of the publicity." It was a theory born of a world he understood, a world of money and transactions, but it was a fantasy. No ransom note ever came. Years began to pass, and the mystery only deepened, calcifying into one of New York's great unsolved legends. The primary theories remained in constant, unresolved orbit. First, the theory of suicide. This was favored by many who pointed to her despondence over her failed writing career and her unhappy home life. Yet, for all its psychological neatness, it lacked proof. No body was ever found, and no note was ever left behind. For a woman who lived by the written word, it seemed unlikely she would depart without leaving one last, definitive text. Second was the theory that she had orchestrated her own disappearance. This remained the most compelling for many, including her mother, who held out hope for years that Dorothy was alive. In this scenario, Dorothy, armed with $25 and a fierce desire for independence, simply walked away from a life that was suffocating her. She could have assumed a new identity, found work, and lived a quiet, anonymous life, free from the strictures of her class. Perhaps she had even made it to Europe after all, traveling under a false name, her trail lost in the chaos of pre-war immigration. Third and darkest was the theory of foul play. This branched into several grim possibilities. The botched abortion theory never fully went away, lingering as a scandalous whisper. Another was that she was the victim of a random, violent crime, her body disposed of so cleverly that it was never found. New York City, for all its Gilded Age glamour, was still a dangerous place. A young woman walking alone and flashing a significant amount of cash could have easily become a target. This theory, however, struggled to explain how such a crime could have been committed on a busy section of Fifth Avenue in the middle of the day without a single witness. As the years turned into a decade, the case continued to produce strange and haunting postscripts. In 1916, a convicted felon in a Rhode Island prison named Edward Glenoris claimed he had been paid $250 to bury the body of a young woman for a well-dressed physician. He claimed the woman had died during an illegal operation and that the doctor was George Griscom. The story was sensational but quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Griscom had a rock-solid alibi, and Glenoris's story was riddled with inconsistencies. He later recanted, admitting he had fabricated the tale in hopes of getting a reduced sentence. Perhaps the most poignant and chilling development came from Francis Arnold himself. For the rest of his life, he remained a man broken by his daughter's disappearance and, perhaps, by the weight of his own early decisions. He continued to pour money into the search, long after any reasonable hope was gone. When he died in 1922, his will made no mention of Dorothy being deceased. Instead, it contained a cold, heartbreaking clause. "I have made no provision in this my will for my beloved daughter, Dorothy H.C. Arnold, as I am satisfied that she is not in want." It was the final, tragic statement from a father who had perhaps come to believe that his daughter had willingly abandoned her family, and he, in turn, was cutting her off from it, forever. His wife, who passed away 6 years later, reportedly believed until her dying day that Dorothy was still alive and would one day return. The house on East 79th Street was eventually sold, its rooms emptied of the family that had lived a quiet tragedy within its walls. The case of Dorothy Arnold was never officially closed, but it has passed from the realm of active investigation into legend. She exists now not as a person, but as a question mark. She is a symbol of the secrets that can lie beneath a placid surface, and of the shocking ease with which a person can be erased by a city. Did she run away to find freedom, or did she meet a tragic end? Was she a victim of her own despair, or of a stranger's violence? Every path of inquiry leads to a dead end. Every theory dissolves under the weight of missing evidence. All that remains is the final haunting image: a stylish young woman in a black velvet hat, waving goodbye to a friend on a busy winter street, before turning to melt into the anonymous river of the crowd, leaving behind nothing but a name and a silence that has now lasted for over a century. The mystery of Dorothy Arnold is a ghost that haunts the Gilded Age, a story of a puzzle with too many missing pieces. But sometimes the pieces are all there, laid out for everyone to see, and yet the picture they form is so monstrous, so unbelievable, that no one wants to look. The John List family murders. There are certain places in the American imagination that exist as monuments to a particular dream. Westfield, New Jersey, in the mid-20th century, was one of those places. It was a town of manicured lawns, sprawling Victorian homes, and quiet, tree-lined streets where children played until the streetlights flickered on. It was a portrait of affluent, post-war suburbia, a place where success was measured by the size of your home and the quiet respectability of your life. It was a sanctuary, seemingly insulated from the chaos and moral decay that many felt was creeping into the cities. And at the heart of this idyllic picture, in a 19-room mansion known as Breeze Knoll, lived the List family. To any outside observer, they were the perfect embodiment of the Westfield dream. The patriarch of this family was John Emil List. At 46 years old in 1971, he was a man who seemed almost to have been created by the town itself. He was an accountant, a World War II and Korean War veteran, and a devout Lutheran who taught Sunday school at the local church. He was a man of unyielding routine and quiet, almost severe discipline. Neighbors described him as distant, formal, and impeccably neat. He wore a suit and tie not just to work, but often around the house, a physical representation of the rigid order he sought to impose on his world. He was, by all accounts, intensely private and deeply unremarkable, the kind of man who could fade into any background, a ghost in a gray flannel suit. His wife, Helen, 47, had once been as much a part of the town's social fabric as her husband, but in recent years she had become more withdrawn. Helen suffered from tertiary syphilis, contracted from her first husband who had died years before she met John. It was a secret she kept from John until shortly after their marriage, and the long-term effects of the disease, combined with her reported heavy drinking, had taken a toll on her health and her spirit. She had pulled away from church activities and social engagements, spending more and more time within the grand, lonely walls of Breeze Knoll. They had 3 children. The eldest, Patricia, known as Patty, was 16. She was a bright, ambitious high school junior with a passion for acting. She dreamed of a life on the stage, a world of creativity and expression that stood in stark contrast to the austere piety of her father. John Jr., at 15, was more his father's son, quiet, serious, and a dedicated soccer player. The youngest, Frederick or Fred, was 13, a lively boy known for his sense of humor. Rounding out the household was John's own mother, Alma, 84 years old, who lived in a spacious apartment on the 3rd floor. From the outside, they were a complete, self-contained unit, a handsome family living in a magnificent home, attending church on Sundays, and upholding all the appearances of a prosperous American life. But Breeze Knoll itself was a metaphor for the family's reality. The 19-room mansion, with its elegant ballroom and a magnificent stained-glass Tiffany skylight rumored to be worth a fortune, was a symbol of a status they no longer possessed. It was a relic of a wealthier past, and it was slowly, surely bankrupting them. The illusion of their life was cracking under immense, silent pressure, and at the center of this pressure was John List. For years, John had been the successful provider, holding a high-ranking position as a vice president at a bank in Jersey City. But in 1965, he was fired. For a man whose entire identity was built on success and control, the shame was unbearable. He didn't tell his family. Instead, for weeks, he continued his daily routine, leaving the house every morning in his suit and tie, spending the day at the train station reading newspapers, and returning home at his usual hour, maintaining the fiction of his employment. He eventually found another, lower-paying job, but the financial slide had begun. By 1971, he was working as an accountant at a firm that paid him a fraction of his former salary. He had lost another job in between, another secret he kept locked away, to keep up the pretense of wealth, the private school tuitions, the mortgage on the mansion. He began methodically siphoning money from his elderly mother's bank accounts, embezzling her life savings to prop up the crumbling facade of his own. This profound financial failure collided with what John perceived as a devastating spiritual one. His rigid Lutheran faith was the bedrock of his existence, and he saw his family drifting away from its righteous path. He saw sin everywhere. He saw it in Helen's drinking and her refusal to attend church regularly. He saw it, most acutely, in Patty's desire to become an actress, an occupation he viewed as decadent and morally corrupt. He believed the permissive culture of the 1960s was seeping into his home, tainting his children, leading them down a path to damnation. He felt he was failing not only as a provider but as the spiritual head of his household. The world was spinning out of his control, and in the quiet, desperate logic of his mind, a monstrous plan began to form. It was not a plan born of rage, but of a chilling, twisted form of love. He decided that if he could not save his family in this life, he would save them for the next. He would send their souls to heaven before they could be further corrupted, a final patriarchal act to ensure their salvation. On the morning of Tuesday, November 9th, 1971, after the children had left for school, John List put his plan into motion. The house was quiet. He took a 9mm Steyr semi-automatic pistol he had brought back from his military service and his father's old .22 caliber revolver. He went to the kitchen, where Helen was finishing her morning coffee. He shot her once in the back of the head. He then went upstairs to the 3rd floor, to his mother Alma's apartment. He found her in her room and shot her over the left eye. He then returned downstairs, dragged his wife's body into the ballroom, and laid her on a sleeping bag. He ate lunch. He spent the rest of the afternoon methodically beginning the process of his own erasure. He went to the post office and stopped the family's mail delivery. He went to the bank to cash his mother's savings bonds. He called the children's schools and the various part-time jobs they held, claiming the family was going to North Carolina to visit a sick relative and would be gone for several weeks. He was calm, collected, and precise. Then he waited for his children to come home. Patty, the 16-year-old aspiring actress, was the first to arrive. As she walked through the door, he shot her in the back of the head. A short time later, 13-year-old Fred came home. John shot him in the same manner. He dragged their bodies into the ballroom and laid them beside their mother. He then left the house and drove to the high school to watch 15-year-old John Jr. play in a soccer game. He drove his son home. As they entered the house, John Jr. began to speak, but before he could finish his sentence, his father shot him repeatedly in the chest and face. It was the only moment his methodical precision seemed to have faltered, a brief, violent flurry in an otherwise cold and calculated affair. With his entire family dead, John List's final preparations began. He laid his children out on sleeping bags next to their mother. He then sat down at the dining room table and wrote a 5-page letter to his pastor, a confession and a justification. In it, he explained his financial difficulties and his spiritual fears. He wrote that he saw too much evil in the world and that he had killed his family to save their souls. He detailed his actions, but insisted it was not out of hate, but out of a sense of divine, albeit tragic, necessity. After finishing the letter, he went through the entire 19-room mansion and painstakingly cut his own face out of every single family photograph. A final, chilling act of self-excision. He left the lights on throughout the house, turned the thermostat down low, and tuned a radio to a religious station, leaving the soft sound of hymns to echo through the empty halls. Then he walked out of Breeze Knoll, locked the door behind him, and vanished into the night. For nearly a month, the house stood silent and still, a brightly lit tomb on a quiet suburban street. Neighbors noticed the lights burning day and night, an unusual sight in the frugal List household. The stopped mail and newspapers began to pile up. The children's friends and teachers grew worried. Patty's drama teacher, in particular, was concerned by her sudden, unexplained absence. On December 7, 1971, almost a full month after the murders, the concerned drama coach and several others, their anxieties finally overriding their reluctance to intrude, called the police. Officers arrived at Breeze Knoll. They found the doors locked, the house eerily silent except for the faint sound of music from within. Forcing their way in, they were met with the cold air and the unsettling sight of a perfectly tidy home. Then they entered the ballroom. There, under the magnificent Tiffany skylight, they found the bodies of Helen List and her 3 children, lying peacefully on sleeping bags, as if they were napping. Upstairs, they found the body of Alma List in her bed. The house was a pristine, ghastly crime scene, the religious music still playing softly on the radio. A final, horrifying testament from a man who had appointed himself his family's savior, and who now had a 28-day head start on the entire world. The discovery inside Breeze Knoll sent a tremor of horror through the tranquil community of Westfield. The town's idyllic image was shattered by a crime that was not just violent, but profoundly, psychologically disturbing. The crime scene was a chilling tableau of domestic order turned macabre. The bodies arranged neatly on sleeping bags, the soft hymn still playing on the radio, and the almost sterile tidiness of the house pointed to a killer who was not frenzied or chaotic, but chillingly methodical. The police found the 5-page letter addressed to Pastor Rewinkle, a document that served as both a confession and a manifesto. In it, John List laid out his twisted rationale. He explained his deep financial ruin, a shame he found too great to bear. But more than that, he detailed his spiritual crisis, his belief that his family was drifting from God and that the temptations of the modern world were leading them toward damnation. "At least I'm certain that all have gone to heaven now," he wrote. "If things had gone on, they would have fallen away from the church." He ended the letter with a plea for understanding and a chilling request. "P.S. Mother is in the hallway in the attic 3rd floor. She was too heavy to move." This letter, combined with the evidence at the scene, left no doubt as to the perpetrator. The question for law enforcement was not who, but where. John List had a month-long head start. The manhunt that followed was one of the largest and most frustrating in the history of the FBI. It was a search for a man who was, by his very nature, an expert at being invisible. John List was the quintessential gray man. He had no distinguishing features, no ostentatious habits, no close friends who could offer insight into his psyche or potential whereabouts. He was meticulously organized, intelligent, and disciplined. He had carefully planned his escape, withdrawing his mother's savings and stopping the mail to buy himself as much time as possible. He was a ghost before he had even left the house. Investigators pieced together his first movements. They found his Ford Galaxy 500 parked at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. The parking ticket showed it had been there since November 10th, the day after the murders. This was a classic piece of misdirection. Did he fly somewhere? Or did he simply abandon the car there and take a bus or a train to disappear into the heart of the country? The FBI placed him on their 10 most wanted fugitives list. His face, in a bland, black and white photograph, was plastered in post offices and federal buildings nationwide. But the photograph itself was part of the problem. It showed a stern, bespectacled man in his mid-40s with a receding hairline. It was a face that could belong to anyone. A librarian, a clerk, a fellow churchgoer. The investigation became a sprawling effort to understand the mind of the man they were hunting. They delved into his past, speaking to former colleagues, neighbors, and the few acquaintances he had. The portrait that emerged was of a man defined by rigidity and failure. He was obsessed with control, yet his life was spiraling out of it. He was a man who craved respect but was secretly unemployed and bankrupt. He was a deeply religious man who meticulously planned a mass murder. The FBI's psychological profile concluded that he was likely to seek out a similar life somewhere else, to find a new community, a new church, and a new, unassuming identity. They believed he would be drawn to accounting or a similar detail-oriented profession. They predicted he would likely remarry, seeking to reconstruct the family structure he had so devastatingly destroyed. As the years passed, the case went cold. Leads dried up. Reported sightings came in from all over the country and even from overseas, but each one proved to be a false alarm. John List seemed to have successfully performed the ultimate act of self-erasure he had started, by cutting his face out of the family photos. The mansion, Breeze Knoll, became a dark local landmark. It stood empty for a year, a monument to the tragedy within its walls, until it was destroyed by a suspicious fire in August 1972. An act of arson that was widely believed to be a symbolic cleansing of the evil that had happened there. A new, modern home was eventually built on the lot, an attempt to literally pave over the town's dark history. For 18 years, John List existed only as a ghost, a file in an FBI cabinet, a name that would occasionally resurface in newspapers on the anniversary of the murders. The agents who had worked the initial case retired. The town of Westfield moved on, its deep scar fading into a faint, historical line. It seemed as though John List had committed the perfect crime, not in the execution of the murders, but in the execution of his disappearance. He had simply stepped out of his life and into the vast anonymity of America. But one person refused to let the case die, an FBI agent named Jack Forrester. He, along with his colleagues, kept the file active, believing that List was too methodical to have simply died or lived a life completely off the grid. The break in the case came not from a new piece of evidence, but from a new form of media. In 1989, a popular television show called America's Most Wanted was revolutionizing cold case investigations. The show, hosted by John Walsh, presented dramatized reenactments of crimes and featured profiles of wanted fugitives, asking the public for their help. The producers of the show agreed to feature the John List case. The FBI and the show's producers knew they had a problem. The only photos of John List were nearly 2 decades old. He would now be in his mid-60s. He would look different. How could the public be expected to recognize a man from a photograph taken 18 years ago? This is where the case took a fascinating and innovative turn. The FBI enlisted the help of a forensic artist and sculptor named Frank Bender. Bender was a pioneer in a unique field, creating three-dimensional clay busts that could predict how a person's appearance would change over time. Working from the old photographs and a detailed psychological profile of Liszt, Bender began his work. He reasoned that Liszt, a man of intense pride and vanity, would not let himself go. He would likely try to maintain a respectable appearance. Bender sculpted a face that was older, heavier, with jowls and a new hairstyle, but he kept the intelligent, intense eyes and the distinctive set of the jaw from the original photos. He created a bust of what John Liszt, the respectable ghost, might look like in 1989. On May 21, 1989, America's Most Wanted aired the segment on the John Liszt murders. They showed the old photographs, recounted the horrifying story, and then, dramatically, they unveiled Frank Bender's sculpture. It was a bust of an ordinary-looking, bespectacled 64-year-old man. They broadcast this image to millions of homes across America. And somewhere, in a suburb of Denver, Colorado, a woman was watching. The face on her television screen was eerily, shockingly familiar. It looked exactly like her neighbor. The broadcast of America's Most Wanted on May 21, 1989, sent a ripple across the country. But in a quiet home in Denver, Colorado, it hit like a tidal wave. A woman watching the program saw the forensic bust created by Frank Bender and was struck by an immediate, chilling sense of recognition. The face on the screen, a clay sculpture of a man who hadn't been seen in 18 years, looked exactly like her former neighbor, a quiet, church-going accountant named Robert Bob Clark. She immediately called the hotline. Her tip was one of hundreds that flooded the show's phone banks that night. But this one felt different. It was specific, it was confident, and it perfectly matched the FBI's psychological profile of what John Liszt would be doing. Living a quiet, unassuming life under a new identity. FBI agents in Denver were dispatched to investigate the lead. They discovered that a man named Robert Clark had lived in the area before recently moving to a suburb of Richmond, Virginia. The agents began to dig into Bob Clark's life, and the details aligned with terrifying precision. Clark was an accountant. He was a devout Lutheran. He had married a woman named Dolores Miller in 1985. He was quiet, fastidious, and kept to himself. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, revealing a picture that had been hidden in plain sight for nearly 2 decades. On June 1, 1989, just 11 days after the television broadcast, FBI agents arrived at a small accounting firm in Richmond. They approached a mild-mannered, bespectacled man in his mid-60s who was sitting at his desk. "We're looking for Robert Clark," they said. The man confirmed that was his name, but when the agents confronted him with their true purpose, he continued to deny his identity. He insisted he was Bob Clark. The agents, however, were certain. Frank Bender's bust was so uncannily accurate that it was like looking at a photograph of the man standing before them. They arrested him on a federal warrant. It wasn't until they compared his fingerprints to the military records of John Emil Liszt that they had their definitive proof. The quiet accountant, Bob Clark, was indeed the ghost they had been hunting for 18 years. The story of John Liszt's life on the run was a testament to his chilling discipline and his ability to disappear into the fabric of society. After murdering his family, he had not flown from JFK Airport. He had taken a bus to Denver. There, he had acquired a new social security number and, using the name Robert Clark, had started his life over. He worked as a cook, then as an accountant. He joined a local Lutheran church, just as the FBI profile had predicted, and became an active member of the congregation. It was there he met Dolores, a widow, and they eventually married. He had successfully reconstructed a version of the life he had abandoned, a quiet suburban existence built on a foundation of unimaginable horror. His new wife, his neighbors, and his colleagues had no idea that the quiet, dependable man they knew was one of the most wanted fugitives in America. He had told Dolores that his first wife had died of cancer and that he was estranged from his children. He had created a new past just as he had created a new present. John Liszt was extradited to New Jersey to stand trial for the murder of his family. His defense team argued that he was suffering from a diminished mental capacity at the time of the killings, claiming he was a victim of post-traumatic stress disorder from his military service, compounded by the extreme pressures of his financial and perceived spiritual failures. They presented him as a man who had snapped, a man whose rigid psychological framework had shattered under unbearable weight. They hoped for a lesser charge, a verdict that acknowledged his mental state. The prosecution, however, painted a very different picture. They presented the evidence of his cold, methodical planning. They highlighted the letter he wrote, his calls to the schools, his trip to the post office, and his calculated purchase of time. This was not the act of a man who had snapped in a moment of passion. This was the work of a man who had made a deliberate, calculated decision to annihilate his family. They pointed to the chilling act of cutting his own face from every photograph, an act that spoke not of a sudden break from reality, but of a pre-planned escape and a conscious effort to erase his identity. The trial lasted for weeks, and on April 12, 1990, the jury delivered its verdict. They found him guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, in sentencing him, called John List a man of inconceivable cruelty. He was given 5 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would spend the rest of his natural life in prison. At his sentencing, List spoke to the court, expressing a strange, detached sorrow. "I feel that because of my mental state at the time, I was not responsible for what happened," he said. "I ask for your prayers for my family." To the very end, he seemed unable or unwilling to fully comprehend the monstrosity of his actions, cloaking them instead in the language of a tragic, misguided spiritual mission. John List died in prison from complications of pneumonia on March 21, 2008, at the age of 82. He remained a quiet, compliant prisoner, a model of the order he had so desperately craved in his own life. His case remains a landmark in the history of criminal investigation, a powerful example of the revolutionary impact of forensic art and public engagement through media. Frank Bender's sculpture did more than just put a face to a ghost. It bridged the gap of time and brought a fugitive to justice long after many believed he was gone for good. But the legacy of John List is more than just a story of a successful manhunt. It is a chilling exploration of the darkness that can fester beneath a surface of absolute normalcy. It's a testament to the fact that the most terrifying monsters are often not the ones who look like monsters, but the ones who look just like us. The case of John List serves as a permanent, horrifying reminder that the quietest suburban street, the most respectable family, and the most devout churchgoer can hide secrets of an evil so profound it almost defies human understanding. It's a story about the complete and utter failure of a man's soul, hidden behind a suit, a tie, and the locked doors of a beautiful home. The methodical evil of John List was eventually brought to light by a community's shared effort to find him. But some crimes are not the work of a single, broken mind. They are systemic, woven into the fabric of a place, and their resolution requires untangling a web of corruption and fear that can span decades. The Wineville chicken coop murders. The Los Angeles of the 1920s was a city built on mythology. It was the land of orange groves and sunshine, a boomtown promising a fresh start under the warm California sky. It was the glittering capital of a new and powerful industry, the movies, a place that manufactured dreams and sold them to the world. But beneath this sun-drenched facade, the city had a deep and rotten core. The Los Angeles Police Department of the era was a notoriously corrupt institution, a brutal and often lawless force more concerned with protecting the interests of the city's elite and maintaining a pristine public image than with serving its citizens. It was a department where inconvenient truths were buried and inconvenient people were broken. For a single working mother in 1928, it was a dangerous machine to stand in front of. Christine Collins was a woman emblematic of the city's promise. She was independent and resilient, a supervisor at the local telephone company who had carved out a life for herself and her 9-year-old son, Walter. They lived in a modest bungalow in the Mount Washington neighborhood, a quiet, respectable corner of the sprawling metropolis. By all accounts, Christine was a devoted and loving mother. Her world revolved around Walter. He was a bright, slightly shy boy, the center of her universe. Their life was simple, orderly, and happy, On Saturday, March 10th, 1928, their world fell apart. Christine was scheduled to work an extra shift at the telephone company. It was a beautiful spring day, and Walter, like any 9-year-old, was eager for an adventure. He begged his mother to let him go to the movies, a common and safe pastime for children of his age. Christine was hesitant to leave him, but she relented. She gave him a dime for his ticket and watched as he stood on the porch, a small, solitary figure full of anticipation. "Goodbye, Mommy," he said, and she replied, "Goodbye, dear." It was the last time she would ever see him. When Christine returned home that afternoon, the house was empty and silent. A wave of unease washed over her. She called for Walter, but there was no answer. She checked with the neighbors. No one had seen him. She went to the local theater, her steps quickening with panic. The show had long since ended, and the theater was empty. Walter was gone. As dusk settled over the city, Christine's unease curdled into raw terror. She called the police. The initial response from the LAPD was dismissive. A missing boy, they reasoned, was almost certainly just a runaway. They were likely dealing with a simple case of a child who had lost track of time or decided to stay with a friend. They assured Christine that he would turn up by morning and took a report with a palpable lack of urgency. But Christine knew her son. Walter was not impulsive or disobedient. He would never have run away. She knew, with the cold certainty that only a mother can possess, that something terrible had happened. As days turned into weeks, Christine Collins became a relentless force. She refused to let the police dismiss her case. She hounded the detectives, provided them with Walter's photograph and dental records, and used her own money to offer a reward. Her persistence began to attract the attention of the press, and the story of the missing boy and his determined mother became a local cause célèbre. This was precisely the kind of attention the LAPD, under the iron-fisted leadership of Police Chief James Two Guns Davis and the notoriously ruthless Captain J.J. Jones, despised. They saw Christine not as a grieving mother seeking help, but as a public relations problem, a squeaky wheel that was making them look incompetent. For 5 agonizing months, there was nothing. The trail went cold. Christine lived in a state of suspended animation, her life defined by a single, gnawing question. Where was Walter? Then, in mid-August, a miracle seemed to happen. A telegram arrived from DeKalb, Illinois. A boy claiming to be the missing Walter Collins had been found. He had a fantastic story about being kidnapped and taken halfway across the country, but he was alive and safe. For the LAPD, this was a godsend. It was the perfect opportunity to turn a story of their failure into a triumphant PR victory. They immediately arranged for the boy to be brought back to Los Angeles, orchestrating a lavish, highly publicized reunion at the train station. Captain Jones himself would be there to oversee the event. They raised money to pay for the boys' train fare and invited reporters and photographers to document the heartwarming conclusion to a story that had captivated the city. Christine was ecstatic, overcome with a relief so profound it felt like a physical weight being lifted from her soul. The nightmare was finally over. On August 18th, 1928, Christine Collins went to the train station to be reunited with her son. The platform was a chaotic scene of flashing camera bulbs and jostling reporters. As the boy stepped off the train and into the arms of a waiting Captain Jones, Christine pushed through the crowd. She looked at him, and in that instant her world, which had just been put back together, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "I do not think that is my son," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The boy was shorter than Walter. He was thinner, and when he smiled, the face was that of a complete stranger. Captain J.J. Jones was a man who did not tolerate complications. He pulled Christine aside, his face a mask of cold fury. He told her she was in shock, that the trauma of the past 5 months had confused her. He insisted that the boy had been through a terrible ordeal and that his appearance had naturally changed. "Take the boy home. Try him out for a couple of weeks," he commanded, his voice low and menacing. "You've made a fool of this department, and you're trying to shirk your responsibility as a mother." The public spectacle he had so carefully arranged was threatening to unravel, and he would not allow it. He pressured her. bullied her, and implicitly threatened her until, overwhelmed and utterly alone on that crowded platform, Christine relented. Numb with disbelief, she took the strange boy's hand and led him through the cheering crowd. She took him back to her home, to Walter's bedroom, a living embodiment of a lie that the city's most powerful institution was forcing upon her. She had come seeking a miracle and had been handed a changeling. She was now a prisoner in her own home, trapped in a waking nightmare orchestrated by the very people who were supposed to protect her. As she closed the door, the silence of the house was no longer one of absence, but of a terrifying, imposed presence. And she knew, with a chilling sense of dread, that her fight was not over. It had just entered a new, far more dangerous chapter. The 3 weeks that followed were a surreal and torturous ordeal for Christine Collins. She was living with a ghost, a boy who wore her son's clothes and slept in her son's bed but was a complete stranger. Every moment was a painful reminder of the lie the Los Angeles Police Department was forcing her to live. The boy, who called himself Walter, was a constant, unnerving presence. He knew none of Walter's friends, had no memory of his teachers, and couldn't recall the name of their family dog. He was circumcised. Walter was not. The physical and emotional discrepancies were overwhelming and undeniable. Yet, the LAPD, led by the implacable Captain Jones, refused to listen. They had closed their case. They had their happy ending, and they would not allow a hysterical woman to ruin it. Christine, however, was not hysterical. She was methodical. She began to gather evidence, documenting every inconsistency. She took the boy to see her dentist, who confirmed from Walter's dental records that this was not the same child. She collected sworn affidavits from neighbors, teachers, and Walter's friends, all of whom stated unequivocally that the boy was an imposter. Armed with this mountain of proof, she returned to Captain Jones's office, naively believing that facts and evidence would surely prevail over the department's public relations agenda. She presented her findings, laying out the irrefutable truth. Captain Jones's reaction was not one of dawning realization, but of cold, calculated fury. He saw Christine's persistence not as a mother's desperate search for her child, but as a direct assault on his authority and the integrity of the LAPD. In his view, she was not just wrong. She was delusional and malicious, a woman intentionally trying to embarrass the department and escape her duties as a mother. He saw only one way to solve the problem of Christine Collins. On September 13, 1928, using a section of the California Penal Code known as Code 12, which allowed for the incarceration of individuals deemed a danger to themselves or others, without a trial or hearing, Captain Jones had Christine Collins forcibly committed to the Los Angeles County General Hospital's psychopathic ward. He had silenced her in the most brutal way possible, locking her away in an asylum and officially branding her as insane. Inside the asylum, Christine found herself trapped in a Kafkaesque nightmare. Her identity was stripped away, her story dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman. She was surrounded by the truly mentally ill, subjected to harsh treatments, and told repeatedly that she would not be released until she admitted that the boy was her son. It was a form of psychological torture designed to break her spirit completely. But even in this desolate place, she refused to recant. Her love for her son and her certainty of the truth were the only things she had left, and she clung to them with ferocious tenacity. While Christine was locked away, the truth about her son's disappearance was beginning to surface in a place far from the glittering lights of Los Angeles, on a dusty, desolate chicken ranch in the small town of Wineville, about 50 miles away. The ranch was owned by a Canadian man named Sanford Clark, who lived and worked there with his young nephew, a 15-year-old boy also named Sanford Clark. The owner's name, however, was Gordon Stewart Northgate. The younger Sanford was not his nephew, but his captive, a boy he had kidnapped from Canada and subjected to years of horrific abuse. In September 1928, the same month Christine was committed to the asylum, the younger Sanford Clark's sister, Jessie, came to visit from Canada. She was horrified by the conditions she found her brother living in and by the clear signs of abuse. She returned to Canada and immediately alerted the American authorities. The U.S. Immigration Service, investigating a potential violation of the Mann Act, which prohibited transporting minors across state lines for immoral purposes, sent 2 agents to the ranch. When they arrived, Gordon Northcott, sensing the net was closing in, fled. The agents took the young Sanford Clark into protective custody. Safe from his captor for the first time in years, the terrified boy began to talk. And the story he told was one of unimaginable horror. He confessed that his uncle, Gordon Northcott, was a serial killer. He described how Northcott had kidnapped, abused, and murdered multiple young boys on the isolated ranch. He then led the investigators to the chicken coop. Beneath the dirt floor, buried in shallow graves filled with quicklime, the police began to find human remains. Body parts, bone fragments, clumps of hair, and bloody axes. The chicken ranch was not just a farm. It was a slaughterhouse. The investigation quickly uncovered that Northcott had an accomplice. His own mother, Sarah Louise Northcott. Sanford Clark told the police that his grandmother had actively participated in at least one of the murders. As the story of the Wineville chicken coop murders exploded in the press, it became a national sensation of gruesome proportions. Gordon Northcott and his mother were now the subjects of an international manhunt. Back in Los Angeles, the news from Wineville reached the ears of Detective G.T. Gus Evans, one of the few officers on the force who had always harbored doubts about the boy claiming to be Walter Collins. He saw a potential connection. He traveled to Wineville to interview Sanford Clark, showing him photographs of the many young boys who had gone missing in Southern California in recent years. When he showed him the picture of Walter Collins, Sanford's reaction was immediate. He identified Walter as one of the boys his uncle had brought to the ranch. He described in detail how Walter, along with 2 other boys, had been held captive and eventually murdered by Northcott with his grandmother's assistance. He even recounted how his uncle had forced him to participate in the disposal of the bodies. The confession provided a horrifying, but definitive, answer to the question of what had happened to Walter Collins. The real Walter was dead, and the boy who had been living in his home, the boy the LAPD had insisted was him, was a complete fraud. The entire foundation of the LAPD's case against Christine Collins crumbled to dust. The news was a devastating blow, a confirmation of her worst fears, but it was also her vindication. Faced with this undeniable evidence, the department had no choice. After 10 days of wrongful imprisonment, Christine Collins was ordered released from the psychopathic ward. She walked out of the asylum not as a madwoman, but as a grieving mother whose story was finally, tragically, believed. The city now had to confront the monster on the chicken ranch and the monsters within its own police department. The release of Christine Collins from the asylum was not a moment of triumph, but one of profound, soul-crushing vindication. The truth had come out, but at a terrible cost. Her son was dead, murdered on a desolate chicken ranch, and the institution that should have helped her had instead victimized her, branding her as insane for daring to speak the truth. The public, which had been manipulated by the LAPD's narrative, now turned on the department with a vengeance. The press, which had once celebrated the reunion, now furiously condemned the police for their cruelty and incompetence. The scandal reached the highest levels of city government, exposing the deep-seated corruption that had allowed such a grotesque injustice to occur. The identity of the imposter was quickly revealed. He was a 12-year-old boy from Iowa named Arthur Hutchins, Jr., a runaway with a troubled home life. Hutchins had been living on the road when he heard a rumor in a roadside diner about the search for the missing Walter Collins. Seeing an opportunity for a free trip to California and a chance to meet his favorite movie star, Tom Mix, Hutchins turned himself in, claiming to be the missing boy. It was a childish, impulsive lie that had spiraled into a waking nightmare, enabled entirely by the LAPD's desperate need for a public relations victory. Faced with Christine's undeniable proof of his identity, Hutchins confessed everything. For his role in the deception, he was sent back to the Iowa State Training School for Boys. Meanwhile, the manhunt for Gordon Stewart Northcott and his mother, Sarah, ended in British Columbia, where they were arrested and extradited back to California to face justice. The trial that followed was a theater of the macabre. Sarah Louise Northcott, in a bid to avoid the death penalty, confessed to the murder of Walter Collins. providing a detailed and gruesome account of how she had bludgeoned the boy to death with an axe on the ranch. Her confession sealed her fate. She was sentenced to life in prison. She would later try to recant, but it was too late. Gordon Northcote's trial was even more sensational. He played the part of the defiant, manipulative showman, firing his lawyers, representing himself, and making wild, contradictory claims. He alternately confessed to and denied killing numerous boys. The evidence against him, however, was overwhelming. The testimony of his nephew, Sanford Clark, was particularly damning. In the end, the jury found him guilty of the murders of 3 boys whose remains were identified. Though he was strongly suspected of killing many more, including Walter Collins, the chaotic state of the gravesite made definitive identification of all the victims impossible. On February 13, 1929, Gordon Stewart Northcote was sentenced to hang. He was executed at San Quentin State Prison on October 2, 1930. For Christine Collins, the legal battles were far from over. Vindicated but not satisfied, she filed a lawsuit against Captain J.J. Jones and the city of Los Angeles for her false imprisonment. In an extraordinary courtroom showdown, she confronted Jones, the man who had tried to destroy her. The jury was moved by her testimony and horrified by the police department's blatant abuse of power. They awarded her $10,800 in damages, a significant sum for the time. Captain Jones, defiant to the end, never paid her a cent. The judgment hung over his head for the rest of his life, a permanent public mark of his disgrace. The scandal forced a review of the Code 12 provision, leading to reforms that made it more difficult for police to arbitrarily commit individuals without due process. The legacy of the Wineville chicken coop murders was vast and lasting. The town of Wineville, its name forever stained by the horrific crimes, officially changed its name to Miraloma in 1930, a desperate attempt to escape its association with the murder farm. The case exposed the brutal realities of the LAPD's corruption, contributing to a wave of public anger that would eventually lead to reforms and the downfall of figures like Chief James Davis. But for Christine Collins, the story never truly ended. Despite Sarah Northcote's confession and Sanford Clark's testimony, a sliver of doubt, or perhaps a sliver of hope, remained, because Walter's body had never been definitively identified among the recovered remains. Christine held onto the belief that her son might have somehow escaped Northcote's ranch. This hope was tragically fueled years later when one of the other boys believed to have been a victim, who had also never been officially identified, was reportedly found alive and well, having escaped the ranch before Northcote could kill him. This single, unconfirmed story was enough to sustain Christine. For the rest of her life, she never stopped searching for Walter. She followed up on every lead, every rumor, every whisper of a boy who might match his description. She never remarried and never had any other children. Her life became a long, quiet vigil, a testament to a mother's unending love and a refusal to surrender to the darkness that had consumed her world. She passed away in 1964, her son's fate still, in her own mind, an open question. The case of Christine Collins and the Wineville chicken coop murders stands as a chilling monument to the duality of Los Angeles itself, a city of manufactured dreams and buried nightmares. It is a story about the terrifying vulnerability of the innocent and the monstrous abuse of power. But at its heart, it is the story of one woman's unbreakable spirit, a mother who, when faced with an institution that tried to erase her child and her own sanity, refused to be silenced, ensuring that the truth, no matter how horrific, would ultimately be heard. The corruption that plagued the LAPD was a slow-burning fire. But some crimes are like explosions, shattering a community in an instant and leaving behind questions that can smolder for generations. The Bath School disaster in the heart of the 1920s, Bath Township, Michigan, was a place of quiet, agricultural rhythms. It was a small, close-knit farming community where life was dictated by the changing of the seasons and the bonds of neighborly trust. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where disputes were settled over a fence post, and where the community's hopes and dreams were rooted in the rich soil they all shared. And the most powerful symbol of that shared dream was the New Bath Consolidated School. Completed in 1922, it was a handsome, modern brick building, a monument to the community's belief in progress and their commitment to their children's future. It was the town's proudest achievement, a place of learning and laughter, the safest and most sacred space in the entire township. Into this world of pastoral simplicity, Andrew Kehoe had arrived in 1919, a highly intelligent and capable man. He purchased a 185-acre farm on the edge of town, a property that was considered one of the finest in the area. At first, Kehoe and his wife, Nellie, seemed to fit right in. He was known for his thriftiness, his meticulous bookkeeping, and his sharp, technical mind. He was not a warm man. Neighbors would later describe him as cold, impatient, and prone to arguments over trivial matters, but he was respected for his expertise. In 1924, his reputation for financial acumen earned him an election to the school board, where he served as treasurer. It was a position of trust and responsibility, placing him at the very heart of the institution he would later seek to destroy. The seeds of Andrew Kehoe's rage were sown in the very soil of progress he seemed to be a part of. The new consolidated school, for all its pride, had come at a steep cost. To fund its construction, the township had levied a new property tax, a significant financial burden on the local farmers. As treasurer, Kehoe was a vocal opponent of these taxes, arguing against what he saw as wasteful spending and government overreach. His public stance as a fiscal hawk, however, masked a deeper, more personal crisis. His farm, once pristine, was beginning to fail. Kehoe, for all his intelligence, was not a skilled farmer. He struggled with the unpredictable nature of agriculture, and his investments soured. He was falling deeper and deeper into debt, and the new school taxes were a constant, galling reminder of his financial decline. His resentment began to fester, poisoning his interactions with the community. He quarreled endlessly with his neighbors. He once beat one of his horses to death, a shocking act of cruelty in a community where livestock were a farmer's lifeblood. His public image began to shift from that of a respected, if difficult, man to that of a bitter and unstable eccentric. In 1926, his downward spiral accelerated when he was defeated in an election for town clerk. For a man with a fragile, narcissistic ego, this public rejection was a profound humiliation. He felt the community had turned against him, that the very people he had tried to serve had betrayed him. The bank began foreclosure proceedings on his farm. The symbol of his initial success was about to be officially repossessed as a failure. While his public life crumbled, his private life was also shrouded in darkness. His wife, Nellie, suffered from a long and painful illness, possibly tuberculosis, that left her frequently bedridden and required long, expensive hospital stays. Her illness further drained Kehoe's already depleted finances and deepened his sense of isolation. He was a man who felt he was losing everything: his money, his status, his farm, and his wife. And in the twisted, paranoid recesses of his mind, he began to assign blame. He blamed the government, he blamed the bank, and above all, he blamed the school board and the new school, the gleaming brick symbol of the taxes that he believed had ruined him. Sometime in mid-1926, Andrew Kehoe began to plot his revenge. It was not a crime of sudden passion, but a meticulously planned, year-long campaign of terror. Using his technical skills and his privileged access as school board treasurer, he began to secretly amass a massive arsenal. He purchased dynamite from local suppliers, claiming he needed it to clear stumps on his farm. He also acquired hundreds of pounds of pyrrhotol, a volatile, incendiary explosive left over from World War I that the government was selling off cheaply to farmers for land clearing. For months, he worked in secret, likely during nights and weekends when the school was empty. He used his keys to let himself into the building and began the slow, painstaking process of wiring the entire structure for destruction. He secretly installed explosives in the crawl spaces beneath the floors of both the north and south wings of the school. He connected them with wires to a timing mechanism, a complex system of his own design. It was the work of a patient, calculating, and deeply evil mind. He was building a bomb beneath the feet of the community's children, turning their sanctuary into a trap. By the spring of 1927, Kehoe's preparations were nearly complete. His farm was lost, his money was gone, and his wife Nellie had returned. From the hospital for the last time, he became even more withdrawn, giving away tools and possessions to neighbors, telling them he was planning to leave Bath. In the days leading up to the attack, he stopped working his land entirely. A neighbor recalled seeing him at his fence line, muttering darkly. The final act of his private war began in the darkness of his own home. At some point on or before the morning of May 18, 1927, Andrew Kehoe murdered his wife. He struck her in the head with a heavy object, ending her long suffering with a final, brutal act of control. He placed her body in a cart in one of the farm's outbuildings. He then moved on to the final stage of his plan. He gathered the rest of his explosives and carefully loaded his truck, packing it with metal scraps, nails, and old tools. Anything that could become lethal shrapnel. He rigged this vehicle to be a massive car bomb. Finally, he connected a timing device to the hundreds of pounds of dynamite and pyritol he had stockpiled in his house and barns. He was setting the stage for a multi-act tragedy, designed to inflict the maximum amount of pain and devastation on the community that he believed had wronged him. On the morning of May 18th, a beautiful spring day, the children of Bath Township made their way to school. The bell rang, and students filed into their classrooms to begin their lessons. It was a day like any other, but beneath their feet, a complex web of wires and dynamite lay silent, waiting, and on a nearby farm, a man who had already murdered his wife climbed into a truck packed with death and drove toward the heart of his community, ready to unleash a hell of his own making. The morning of May 18th, 1927, unfolded with the ordinary, cheerful hum of a small town. In the classrooms of the Bath Consolidated School, children were settling in for their final lessons before the summer break. The air was filled with the familiar sounds of a school day. The scrape of chalk on a blackboard, the murmur of recitation, the rustle of turning pages. For the 314 students and their teachers, it was a day like any other, a placid moment in the predictable rhythm of their lives. They were completely unaware that they were sitting on a powder keg, that the very foundation of their school had been transformed into a monstrous instrument of death. At precisely 8:45 a.m., Andrew Kehoe's meticulously laid plan began to unfold. Miles away, on his doomed farm, a timing device he had set triggered a massive explosion. The farmhouse, the barns, and all the outbuildings erupted in a terrifying fireball, the blast sending a plume of black smoke and debris hundreds of feet into the air. The explosion was a thunderous, violent announcement, a cataclysm designed to draw the attention of the entire township. Volunteer firefighters and concerned neighbors, seeing the smoke billowing from the Kehoe property, immediately rushed toward the farm, believing they were responding to a tragic, but accidental, fire. It was a calculated diversion, a brilliant and evil piece of tactical planning. Kehoe knew the explosion would pull the town's emergency resources away from the true target of his rage. Almost simultaneously, the second and most horrific part of his plan was triggered. Back at the Bath Consolidated School, the alarm clock he had hidden in the basement, its hands ticking down to a predetermined moment of annihilation, completed its circuit. It sent an electrical charge surging through the wires Kehoe had painstakingly laid over the preceding months. The charge was meant to detonate the hundreds of pounds of dynamite and pyritol he had secreted beneath both the north and south wings of the school. What happened next was a combination of catastrophic success and sheer, dumb luck. The detonator for the south wing failed. The wiring, for some unknown reason, did not complete the circuit, leaving the 500 pounds of explosives beneath that side of the building terrifyingly inert. But the charge connected to the north wing worked perfectly. At approximately 8:47 a.m., the north wing of the Bath Consolidated School disintegrated in a deafening, earth-shattering blast. The explosion lifted the entire structure from its foundation before it collapsed in on itself. The roof was blown apart, the walls imploded, and floors pancaked downwards, crushing everything and everyone beneath them. The scene was one of instant, unimaginable carnage. A massive cloud of dust, plaster, and smoke enveloped the building, and the cheerful sounds of the school morning were replaced by a horrifying cacophony of shattering glass, splintering wood, and the screams of the dying and the wounded. Inside the school, Survivors were plunged into a world of darkness, dust, and terror. Children were buried alive under piles of rubble, pinned beneath heavy desks and fallen beams. The air was thick with choking dust, making it impossible to see or breathe. Teachers, many of them injured themselves, fought to make sense of the chaos, their first instinct to protect the children in their care. One teacher, Bernice Sterling, recalled being thrown against the wall by the force of the blast. Dazed and bleeding, she could hear the cries of her students trapped in the debris around her. The sound of the explosion echoed for miles, a terrible summons to the rest of the community. People rushed from their homes and businesses, their faces etched with disbelief and fear. What they saw when they arrived at the school was a scene from a war zone. The proud, modern building, the symbol of their community's future, was a smoking, mangled wreck. The north wing had simply ceased to exist, replaced by a mountain of jagged brick, twisted metal, and splintered timber. The initial shock gave way to a frantic, desperate rescue effort. Fathers, mothers, and neighbors descended on the rubble, clawing at the debris with their bare, bleeding hands. They ignored the risk of further collapse, driven by a primal need to reach the children trapped inside. The scene was a chaotic mix of heroism and horror. Men formed human chains to lift heavy concrete slabs. Women tended to the wounded, tearing strips from their own clothing to make makeshift bandages. The town doctor, J.A. Crum, and his wife, a nurse, had been on their way to the Kehoe Farm fire when the school exploded. They turned around and established a makeshift triage center on the school's lawn, which was quickly turning into a field hospital. The dead and the dying were laid out side by side, a heartbreaking testament to the scale of the tragedy. It was into this scene of chaos and grief, about half an hour after the initial explosion, that Andrew Kehoe drove his final instrument of death. He steered his shrapnel-packed Ford truck through the crowd of rescuers and pulled up to the curb directly in front of the devastated school. He saw the carnage he had wrought, the weeping parents, the frantic rescuers, the small, still forms being carried from the wreckage. He saw the school superintendent, Emery Hike, who had been one of his primary antagonists on the school board. Hike, who had been inside the building when it exploded but had miraculously survived, rushed over to Kehoe's truck. "Andy," he yelled, "my God, your school is blown up." Kehoe looked at him, his face a mask of cold fury. He leveled a rifle at Hike. In that moment, a struggle ensued. According to witnesses, Hike and another man wrestled with Kehoe over the rifle. But Kehoe had one last terrible surprise. He had rigged his truck to be a massive car bomb, and he now triggered the device. The truck exploded with a ferocious, deafening roar. The blast tore through the crowd, sending a deadly spray of metal, nails, and glass flying in all directions. The shrapnel ripped through the bodies of the rescuers, parents, and first responders, cutting down those who had come to help. The explosion killed Kehoe instantly. It also killed Superintendent Hike, the man Kehoe seemed to have been targeting. A retired farmer named Nelson McFarren, who had been helping with the rescue, was killed. So was the postmaster, Glenn Smith, whose father-in-law was a member of the school board. Several others were horribly maimed, their bodies shredded by the flying debris. This second blast, a final, spiteful act of murder-suicide, plunged the scene into even deeper chaos. It was a clear and horrifying message. Kehoe's rage was not just directed at the building, but at the people themselves, at the very fabric of the community he sought to annihilate. The rescue effort faltered for a moment in the face of this new horror, but then resumed with a grim, hardened determination. They now knew they were not dealing with a tragic accident, but with a deliberate, monstrous act of human evil. The day that had begun with sunshine and promise had become the darkest in Michigan's history. A massacre orchestrated by a man who had chosen to make his own personal hell the entire world's problem. In the aftermath of the second explosion, a grim silence fell over the lawn of the Bath Consolidated School, punctuated only by the cries of the newly wounded and the frantic shouts of those trying to help them. Andrew Kehoe's final, suicidal act had transformed the rescue site into a second front of the massacre. The community, already reeling from the devastation of the school, now had to contend with the horrifying reality that the killer had been in their midst, waiting to strike again. The rescue efforts, however, did not stop. Fueled by a mixture of grief, rage, and adrenaline, the people of Bath continued their desperate work, pulling survivors from the rubble throughout the long, terrible afternoon. As the day wore on, the full, staggering scale of the tragedy came into focus. In total, 44 people were dead or would soon die from their injuries. 38 of them were children, most between the ages of 7 and 14. The dead also included 2 teachers, the school superintendent, the postmaster, a retired farmer, and Andrew Kehoe himself. Another 58 people were severely injured, many maimed for life. It was, and remains to this day, the deadliest act of violence ever perpetrated at a school in American history. The investigation that followed was largely a formality, a matter of cataloging the horror rather than solving a mystery. Kehoe's guilt was undeniable. The letter he left on his farm's fence, a wooden sign with the hand-painted words, "Criminals are made, not born," served as his final, cryptic manifesto. When investigators entered the still-standing south wing of the school, they made a discovery that was both a relief and a source of profound terror. They found the 500 pounds of unexploded dynamite and pyritol, still wired and ready to detonate. A faulty connection in Kehoe's homemade timer had been the only thing that prevented the death toll from more than doubling. The entire school and every child and teacher inside it had been meant to perish. The realization that the disaster, as horrific as it was, could have been twice as bad sent a fresh wave of shock through the already traumatized community. The national response was immediate and overwhelming. The story of the Bath School disaster dominated headlines across the country, knocking Charles Lindbergh's historic transatlantic flight, which happened just 2 days later, off many front pages. Donations poured in from all over the nation. The Red Cross, led by local physicians, set up a disaster relief center and provided aid and comfort to the grieving families. The famed Michigan Senator, James Couzens, donated a substantial sum to help rebuild the school and the community. Condolences arrived from governors, mayors, and ordinary citizens, all trying to make sense of an act that seemed to defy comprehension. In the days that followed, Bath became a town of funerals. Processions were held day after day, sometimes for multiple children at once. The small cemeteries were filled with fresh graves, stark white markers bearing the names of children whose futures had been stolen in an instant. The shared grief was a heavy, suffocating blanket over the town. Every family was affected, whether through the loss of a child, a friend, or a neighbor. The bonds of the community, once a source of strength, were now a conduit for a collective, unending sorrow. The legacy of the Bath School disaster is a complex and painful one. For decades, the town of Bath struggled with how to remember, or even speak about, the event. The surviving children, many of whom carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives, rarely talked about what they had experienced. It was a trauma too deep, a memory too horrific to be easily articulated. The town itself seemed to engage in a collective act of forgetting, not out of disrespect, but out of a need for self-preservation. The destroyed north wing of the school was eventually torn down, and a new wing was built in its place, funded by the outpouring of national donations. The school was renamed the James Couzens Agricultural School in honor of its benefactor, an act that some saw as an attempt to erase the stain of the past. Over time, however, the community began to find ways to memorialize the victims and confront their history. A small, elegant sculpture of a grieving woman holding a child, titled Girl with a Cat, was placed in a museum at Michigan State University, a quiet and artistic tribute. In 1975, the old school was demolished, but its original cupola was preserved and is now part of a memorial park that stands on the site. The park contains a bronze plaque bearing the names of all the victims, ensuring that they will never be forgotten. The story of Andrew Kehoe became a dark case study in domestic terrorism and the psychology of mass murder. He was not an outsider who attacked a community. He was a product of it. He was an intelligent, respected man who harbored a deep and corrosive narcissism, a man whose personal and financial failures morphed into a murderous rage against the society he blamed for them. His actions were a chilling precursor to the types of targeted mass violence that would become tragically more common in the century to come. He used tools of industry, dynamite meant for farming, a truck meant for hauling, and turned them into weapons of mass destruction. He attacked a soft target, a place of innocence, to inflict the deepest possible wound on the community. His crime was not just murder. It was an assault on the very idea of a safe and civil society, a brutal violation of the sacred trust that underpins any community. And in the end, the quiet, pastoral town of Bath, Michigan, was left to pick up the pieces, a community forever defined by one man's decision to burn down his world and take everyone else with him. The St. Valentine's Day massacre the city of Chicago in the winter of 1929 was a kingdom divided. It was a place of astonishing energy and profound contradiction, a metropolis of soaring new skyscrapers and grimy, smoke-choked neighborhoods. But its true power structure wasn't housed in City Hall. It operated in the backrooms of speakeasies, in the basements of breweries, and in the minds of the men who controlled the city's most lucrative and illegal enterprise, alcohol. The era of Prohibition had turned Chicago into a battlefield, and the prize was a black market worth hundreds of millions of dollars. This wasn't just crime. It was an industry, with corporate structures, supply chains, and territorial disputes that were settled not with lawsuits, but with bullets. At the head of this vast criminal empire sat Alphonse Al Capone. By 1929, Capone had transformed from a simple street tough into a figure of international renown. He was the CEO of the Chicago outfit, the dominant South Side gang, and he ruled his territory with a combination of charismatic charm and breathtaking brutality. He was a master of public relations, donating to charities and cultivating a Robin Hood-like image, while simultaneously presiding over a network of corruption that reached into every corner of the city's police force and political machine. Capone saw himself not as a gangster, but as a businessman, a provider of a public service that the government had foolishly outlawed. And like any good CEO, he was obsessed with market consolidation. There was just one major competitor standing in the way of his total monopoly: the North Side Gang. The North Siders were a formidable, predominantly Irish-American crew, and their leader was George "Bugs" Moran. Moran was everything Capone was not. Where Capone was disciplined and strategic, Moran was flamboyant, arrogant, and hot-headed. He openly despised Capone, famously sneering that the South Side boss dresses up in fancy underwear to fool the ladies. The animosity between the two men was personal, but their war was all business. For years, the two gangs had been locked in a bloody, back-and-forth conflict that had left a trail of bodies across the city. The North Side's previous leaders, first Dion O'Banion and then Himmy Weiss, had both been assassinated by Capone's men. Now Bugs Moran was in charge, and the violence had only escalated. Hijackings of liquor trucks were common, and assassinations were a constant threat. The city was holding its breath, waiting for the final, decisive battle in this long and brutal war. From his palatial estate in Palm Island, Florida, his own version of a winter White House, Al Capone decided it was time to end the war once and for all. The plan that was hatched was one of audacious simplicity and chilling precision. It wasn't just about killing Bugs Moran. It was about decapitating the entire North Side operation in a single, devastating stroke. The key to the plan was a lure, an offer so good that Moran couldn't possibly refuse. Capone's men, posing as bootleggers, would reach out to Moran with a proposition: a hijacked shipment of high-quality old log cabin whiskey, one of the most sought-after brands, was available for a bargain price. This wasn't just any whiskey. It was to be supplied by Detroit's notorious Purple Gang, a group Moran trusted. The deal was set. The delivery would take place at 10:30 a.m. on Thursday, February 14th, at the North Side Gang's primary headquarters. The headquarters was a nondescript brick garage at 2122 North Clark Street. The building, leased under the name SMC Cartage Company, was the nerve center of Moran's bootlegging operation. It was where they stored their trucks, tuned their engines, and coordinated their logistics. It was a place of work, a symbol of the gang's day-to-day business. On the morning of St. Valentine's Day, 1929, the garage was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of oil and unburned gasoline. Inside, a group of men gathered, waiting for the promised whiskey shipment. 7 men were in the garage that morning. There was Adam Heyer, the gang's business manager and accountant, and James Clark, Moran's brother-in-law and a low-level enforcer. There were the gang's primary muscle, the infamous Gus Enberg brothers, Peter and Frank, both seasoned and ruthless gunmen. Also present was Albert Weinshank, a man who bore a striking resemblance to Bugs Moran in build and dress, a fact that would prove tragically significant. He was there to oversee the transfer. The final 2 men were not even core members of the gang. John May was a mechanic hired to work on the gang's trucks. And in a twist of fate that highlights the random cruelty of the event, there was Dr. Reinhard Schwimmer. Schwimmer was an optometrist, a gangster groupie, who was fascinated by the criminal underworld. He loved the thrill of rubbing shoulders with notorious men, a hobby that had placed him in the wrong place at the absolute worst time. The one man who was conspicuously not there was the primary target, Bugs Moran. He was running late. As he and his 2 bodyguards approached the Clark Street garage shortly after 10:30, he saw a car that made him stop in his tracks. It was a black Cadillac sedan, the type used by police detectives. Moran, assuming a police raid was in progress, immediately ducked into a nearby coffee shop. It was a simple, pragmatic decision made by a career criminal looking to avoid a routine arrest. He had no idea that this small twist of fate, this mundane act of being a few minutes late, had just saved his life. Back at the garage, the men inside heard the Cadillac pull up. A moment later, 4 men entered the building. 2 were dressed in sharp suits and overcoats, looking like city detectives. The other 2 were wearing the full official uniforms of Chicago police officers. The effect was immediate and disarming. The 7 men inside, including the hardened Gus Enberg brothers, saw the uniforms and assumed this was just another police shakedown, a common nuisance in their line of work. They offered no resistance. One of the uniformed officers commanded them to line up and face the bare brick wall at the back of the garage. Compliantly, believing they were about to be frisked and arrested, the 7 men did as they were told. They turned their backs on the intruders, their hands raised, their bodies forming a neat, orderly line. They stood in the cold, dusty air, facing the wall, completely oblivious. This was not an arrest. This was an execution squad, and their targets had just willingly arranged themselves for slaughter. For a few heartbeats, the only sound in the cold Clark Street garage was the low hum of an engine from the street outside. The 7 men stood facing the grimy brick wall, their hands in the air, a posture of surrender. They were professional criminals, accustomed to the rituals of a police raid. They expected to be searched, perhaps roughed up a little, and then hauled downtown. Their compliance was a business decision, a routine cost of their illegal enterprise. But this was no routine raid. The men who had entered the garage were not there to enforce the law. They were there to impersonate it in the service of a far more final judgment. The 2 men dressed as civilians, the detectives, stepped forward. They were armed not with service revolvers, but with Thompson submachine guns, the infamous Tommy guns that had become the signature weapon of the Chicago underworld. The 2 uniformed officers were armed with a sawed-off shotgun and a .45 caliber pistol. Without a word, they opened fire. The sound was deafening, a percussive, thunderous roar that filled the cavernous space of the garage. The 4 assassins systematically raked the line of men with a relentless barrage of bullets. The Tommy guns, firing at a rate of over 800 rounds per minute, tore into the men's backs, their high-velocity slugs ripping through flesh and bone. The shotgun blasts added a deeper, more brutal note to the chorus of death. The execution was carried out with a terrifying, almost inhuman efficiency. It was over in less than a minute. The 7 men crumpled to the oil-stained concrete floor, their bodies twisted and broken, lying in a rapidly expanding pool of blood. The assassin's work was not yet finished. The plan was as much about the escape as it was about the execution, designed to further cement the illusion of a police action. After the shooting stopped, The two men in civilian clothes, the triggermen, walked out of the garage with their hands raised, prodded along by the two uniformed officers. To any curious neighbors or passers-by who might have been drawn by the noise, the scene looked exactly as it was intended to. Two police officers had just conducted a raid and were now escorting two arrested gangsters from the scene. The four men climbed back into the black Cadillac and drove away calmly, melting back into the city's traffic. They left behind a scene of almost unimaginable slaughter. The first person to enter the garage after the killers had left was the building's landlady, who had heard the commotion from her apartment upstairs. She opened the door to a vision of hell. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and blood. On the floor lay a tangled heap of bodies, so thoroughly riddled with bullets that they were barely recognizable. Her screams alerted the neighborhood, and soon the real Chicago police arrived. The initial responding officers were met with a scene of such brutality that it shocked even these hardened veterans of the city's gang wars. They found more than 70 spent shell casings littering the floor. Miraculously, amid the carnage, one man was still alive. Frank Gussenberg, one of the gang's toughest enforcers, was clinging to life despite having been shot at least 14 times. He was rushed to a nearby hospital. The police, desperate for a lead, tried to question him. "Who shot you, Frank?" they asked. Gussenberg, adhering to the gangster's strict code of silence, the omerta, refused to talk. His famous last words were a testament to that code. "Nobody shot me," he whispered. He died 3 hours later, taking the identity of his killers to his grave. The news of the massacre spread through Chicago like a shockwave. The sheer, calculated brutality of the crime stunned the public and the criminal underworld alike. This was a new level of violence, a crime that felt different from the usual tit-for-tat gangland slangs. This was an organized paramilitary operation. Suspicion immediately fell on Al Capone. The motive was obvious, and the execution had all the hallmarks of his methodical planning. But Capone, of course, had the perfect alibi. He had been at his home in Florida the entire time, and he had even made sure to be seen by witnesses, including a local prosecutor, at the exact time of the murders. He publicly expressed his shock and sorrow over the event, playing the part of the concerned citizen. Bugs Moran, the man who had been the primary target, was alive, but his gang was shattered. When reporters found him, he was seething with rage, but also clearly shaken. "Only Capone kills like that," he declared. The massacre effectively ended his reign as a significant power in the Chicago underworld. His top enforcers were dead, his organization was in ruins, and his reputation was destroyed. He had survived, but he had lost the war. The investigation into the massacre was a massive, high-profile affair, but it was fraught with difficulty from the start. The police were dealing with a crime where the victims were notorious criminals and the prime suspect was the most powerful man in the city, a man who held half the police force in his pocket. There were no surviving witnesses willing to talk. The physical evidence was scant. The assassins had been disciplined, leaving behind only the shell casings. Forensic science in 1929 was in its infancy. Ballistics analysis was a new and developing field. A pioneering forensic scientist named Calvin Goddard was brought in to analyze the casings. Using a comparison microscope, he was able to definitively link the bullets to specific Tommy guns, but this only confirmed what was already suspected. The challenge was finding the guns themselves. The police investigation began to focus on identifying the assassins. Rumors swirled through the underworld. Names were whispered, but no one would testify. The most prominent theory pointed to a group of killers from outside Chicago, a crew known as the American Boys, who were associated with Capone. Another theory suggested the involvement of gunmen from St. Louis known as Egan's Rats. But without witnesses or a confession, these were just theories. The wall of silence was absolute. The police rounded up known Capone associates, including his top enforcer, Jack "Machine Gun" McGurn, who was widely suspected of having organized the hit. McGurn, however, had his own perfect alibi. He had been checked into a hotel with his girlfriend, the blonde alibi, at the time of the murders. The break in the case seemed to come months later, in December 1929. Police in Michigan raided the home of a known Capone associate named Fred "Killer" Burke. In his house, they found a small arsenal of weapons, including 2 Thompson submachine guns. Calvin Goddard was called in to examine the weapons. He fired test bullets and compared them to the casings from the Clark Street garage. The results were a perfect match. These were the guns that had been used in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. The police had found the murder weapons. They now had a direct physical link between a known Capone gunman and the crime. It was the biggest breakthrough yet, a tangible piece of evidence in a case built on shadows and whispers. The net, it seemed, was finally closing in on at least one of the men responsible for the city's most infamous crime. The discovery of the 2 Tommy guns in Fred "Killer" Burke's home was a monumental breakthrough for the beleaguered investigators. For the first time, they had a direct physical link between a known member of the criminal underworld and the massacre. Burke, already wanted for the murder of a police officer in St. Joseph, Michigan, was now the most sought-after man in the country. However, finding the guns was one thing. Finding the man was another. Burke had gone to ground, disappearing into the vast network of criminal hideouts that spanned the Midwest. The investigation had a smoking gun, but the hand that had held it was once again lost in the shadows. While the hunt for Burke continued, the political and social fallout from the massacre began to fundamentally reshape the landscape of crime in America. The event, in all its brutal spectacle, had horrified the public in a way that previous gangland killings had not. It was the bloody exclamation point on a decade of lawlessness. The image of 7 men being gunned down by assassins disguised as police officers shattered any romantic notions of the gentleman gangster. It exposed the raw, nihilistic violence at the heart of the bootlegging empires. The public's tolerance for the open warfare on their streets evaporated. The outcry was so immense that it reached the highest office in the land. President Herbert Hoover, newly inaugurated, famously declared Al Capone public enemy number 1 and instructed his federal agencies to bring him down by any means necessary. This shift in focus was critical. The government realized that charging Capone with murder or bootlegging was nearly impossible. Witnesses were too terrified to testify, and Capone's network of corruption provided him with a nearly impenetrable shield. So, federal prosecutors, led by a determined U.S. attorney named George E.Q. Johnson, decided to attack him from a different angle. They wouldn't go after his guns. They would go after his books. A quiet, methodical agent from the Treasury Department named Elliot Ness and his team of untouchables launched a high-profile campaign to disrupt Capone's brewing operations, but the real damage was being done by a team of forensic accountants who were meticulously combing through ledgers and receipts, building a case for a crime that was far less glamorous but much easier to prove: income tax evasion. In 1931, the federal government finally got its man. Al Capone was indicted, tried, and convicted not for murder, but for failing to pay taxes on his vast illegal income. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, first in Atlanta and then at the newly opened maximum security facility on Alcatraz Island. The man who had once ruled Chicago was broken. His criminal empire crumbled without his leadership, and his health deteriorated rapidly in prison due to untreated syphilis. The St. Valentine's Day massacre, the very act that had solidified his absolute power, had also triggered the massive federal response that ultimately led to his downfall. It was the ultimate ironic legacy. His greatest triumph was the direct cause of his greatest defeat. The fates of the other key players were equally grim, a testament to the violent world they inhabited. Fred "Killer" Burke, the man whose guns were used in the massacre, was eventually captured on a farm in Missouri. He was convicted for the murder of the Michigan police officer and sentenced to life in prison, where he died of a heart attack in 1940. He was never officially charged for his role in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Jack "Machine Gun" McGurn, the man widely believed to have organized the hit, met his own violent end. In 1936, he was gunned down by unknown assailants in a Chicago bowling alley. In a final, symbolic gesture, the assassins left a comical Valentine on his body. Bugs Moran, the man who had survived by being late, saw his power and influence evaporate. The war was over and he had lost. He faded into obscurity, reduced to committing petty crimes like robbing banks and post offices. He died of lung cancer in 1957 while serving a sentence in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was never officially solved. No one was ever convicted for the 7 murders committed in that cold garage on Clark Street. The identities of the 4 shooters have been debated by historians for decades, with the names of Burke, McGurn, and various members of Egan's Rats and the American Boys surfacing repeatedly, but no theory has ever been definitively proven. The crime remains a perfect, brutal enigma, a testament to the power of the criminal code of silence. However, the legacy of the event extends far beyond its status as an unsolved mystery. It was a crucial turning point in the history of American law enforcement. The public outcry and the subsequent federal intervention marked the beginning of the end for the romanticized gangster era. It spurred the development and funding of more sophisticated forensic techniques, like the ballistics work done by Calvin Goddard, and highlighted the need for a coordinated, national approach to fighting organized crime, which would eventually lead to the expansion of the FBI's power and jurisdiction. It was the crime that finally forced America to reckon with the consequences of prohibition, fueling the growing movement for its repeal, which finally came in 1933. In a very real way, the massacre was the death rattle of the Roaring Twenties, a final bloody spasm of violence that ushered in a new era of federal law enforcement and a more sober, less tolerant public attitude toward organized crime. The 7 men who died on that Valentine's Day became unwilling martyrs, their deaths serving as the catalyst that helped to dismantle the very criminal empires they had helped to build.